So welcome. I'm Gary Langer, president of Langer Research Associates. It's the Ides of March, beware, 2019. And I'm here for the AAPOR Heritage interview with Professor John Krosnick of Stanford University. And we're going to talk about John's career and his work and his love of AAPOR. So here we go. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Gary.
Good to see you.
This. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, as always. First question is just to take you back. Why the heck and how did you get into the field of survey research? What were you thinking?
Well, as a high school student, I fell in love with science. Took the physics and chemistry and math courses and assumed that I would end up becoming, like my father, a physician. And went to Harvard as an undergraduate thinking, there was no real official pre-med major, so I would pick something that sounded challenging and interesting. So I somehow arbitrarily chose biochemistry, which had no implications at all. But that first semester as an undergrad, I took the required math course and the required chemistry course and the required language course, and I had one spot open in my schedule. And Harvard at that time, maybe still today, provided a big fat book that described every course at the university in half a page of single-spaced text. So you really knew what those choices were. I can't tell you now how this happened, but I read the entire book and I decided the course I should take is a course in psychology of politics. So I went to the first lecture, big lecture hall, hundreds of students in it in the basement of the psychology department, taught by a very distinguished senior guy, Tom Pettigrew. And I sat in the back and listened to the lecture, and I thought, okay, this sounds good. So the end of the lecture comes, and he says, okay, we're done for today. See you next week. However, I'd like to talk up here to the following people. He reads off a bunch of names. Boom, 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 Krosnick, boom, boom. What? Okay. So I go up to the front of the room, and he says, okay, you guys are all freshmen. You're not prepared to take this course. You have not got the prerequisites. I strongly advise you don't take it. But if you take it, it's up to you. Good luck. So I thought, well, but this is the thing I want to take. And so I'm going to try it. And that changed everything for me. I completely fell in love with it. I abandoned biochemistry and I abandoned medicine, to my parents' great distress in the short term. It took a long time for me to end up having my research written about in the New York Times when they finally decided, okay, this was a reasonable thing for him to do. But the course really put me on that pathway of social science, because what I learned for the first time was that the substance I was interested in, how people think, how they make decisions, how people work together as a collective, could be studied using scientific methods and using the math and statistics that I loved. And so I thought, okay, great, let's do this. So I ended up doing my first research project was the next semester in a research course, also with Tom, where I somehow made a connection to CBS Records here in Manhattan, and met a gentleman, because I was playing lots of music at that time and very interested in jazz, and told him what I was up to, and he said, hey, maybe you would like to do a research project for us at CBS. So I ended up doing a project as my course project, which ended up getting published, and so that was really quite fun, and that just put me on the pathway. So I was lucky to have mentors who inspired me and that took me in the direction of survey.
So the first Krosnick research project, tell us a little more about that CBS project.
Well, actually, there are some very interesting links even to today. So that project at the time came from a guy who was an executive at CBS Records, who was in part responsible for jazz. And he was frustrated that every time a new jazz record came out, he had to devote budget to selling that record. And every time the next record came out, he'd spend more money to try to promote that record. And he had this idea of generic advertising, of actually trying to advertise jazz broadly to bring more people in to hear the music. And so I thought, okay, this is perfect. I love jazz. I know all about the genre. And so I went back to Harvard. I found this questionnaires that were, so we monitored jazz sales at record stores in town, but we also attached questionnaires to the jazz records. So when you picked a record out of the bin, there would be a questionnaire, a little postcard attached to the back of it that would ask you some questions. And so this was a way of getting a bit more data on whether so we did data collection before the ads and after the ads, so we could see whether the nature of the people buying the records changed over time as a result of the ads, that maybe we would get more non-jazz people in there. So the answer is that over that time period, it just so happens that the trend in jazz sales was slightly downward, and it became less downward after the ads than before. Hard to know what exactly that did. There was a little increase in the diversity of the buyers afterwards than before, but it was, maybe 3 weeks of data collection before and 3 weeks of data collection afterwards. It was a nice start, but I got a taste of it, and it was fun.
What's so funny about this is, of course, that I attended a New York AAPOR session last night, in which you talked about your latest work on advertising impacts.
Exactly.
So, what goes around comes around.
Exactly. Yeah. And the reason it really goes around is that one of those projects that I talked about was generic advertising for political parties. Instead of advertising one candidate at a time, we were looking at ads for parties.
Yep. Amazing. Okay, and that was an undergraduate project?
It was.
Crazy. Wow. So you struggled through Harvard, and next call is got to be the decision. We'll be returning to this theme as to whether to get a job, to go off and bang on drums, or to continue your studies. Was this a tough call? Did you go straight to graduate school? Was there a break in between?
Yes, but not for the reason that you're thinking.
All right.
So I had decided, I was a serious drummer and percussionist in high school, and by the time I went to college, instead of going to Eastman or Curtis or another conservatory, I had decided if I wanted to do something like science and music, that I had a better shot at being a scientist with music on the side than being a musician with science on the side.
Mm-hmm.
So that I already was on that pathway. And as soon as I fell in love with social science, I knew graduate school was coming. So there was no searching or puzzling at that point. But the reason I took a break, actually, of 2 years in between, is I was waiting for my later to become wife, Kathy Heaney, to finish her undergraduate degree. And so she had some extra years, and we had come into Harvard at the same time and met not long after, but she then took a little time off, so she needed to come back and finish up. So I stayed in Cambridge, and this was a really lucky break for me, that it was no sacrifice professionally, because during those 2 years I was very lucky to get jobs as a research assistant with Chick Judd in psychology and Al McAllister in public health, and I went to graduate school with 5 or 6 publications already that I was an author of. And I was pretty socialized. I'd been taught how to do research.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I hit the ground running in grad school in a way that helped.
Okay, so tell us about grad school, the decision of where to go and then the experience there.
So Chick was my inspiration at Harvard, and he said, okay, look, don't go to Harvard. We'll let you in here, but don't go here. You've made the most of what we have to offer. You need to go somewhere else. And given your interest in surveys, Michigan is the place to go. So if you get into Michigan, go. And if you go to Michigan, work with Dwayne Allwyn. Dwayne was at Michigan not for very long as a sociologist and in the Survey Research Center. And so that was an easy choice to select Michigan, because I knew I wanted to go to school in social psychology. And there were great social psychology programs that admitted me elsewhere, but nowhere that was with a survey center that was in an interdisciplinary setting like the Institute for Social Research. Mm-hmm. What I didn't know was, at the time I was deciding to go to Michigan, Don Kinder was also deciding to go to Michigan. He was leaving Yale and coming to start at Michigan. And he ended up being a huge inspiration and my dissertation advisor. His PhD also is in social psychology. His faculty appointment at Michigan was jointly in psychology and political science, and it's really his pathway that I ended up following in many ways. But I was very lucky to work with Dwayne and with Howard Schuman in sociology, both of whom were doing important cutting-edge stuff on survey methods. Dwayne from a statistical point of view, Howard from an experimental point of view. And by the end of graduate school, I was a survey researcher. I was in love with the whole thing.
Yeah, what's interesting is that you went in with a focus, not a sole focus, but with a focus on measurement, on how we figure out the answer through empirical methods, which is not always the case, right? There's a lot of exploration that gets done in a more qualitative sense, or that's simply less focused. What is it about the measurement that appealed to you so much?
Well, really two things. One is I saw, sadly, at that time, examples of big fat books in the social sciences that were filled with great theoretical ideas, but that actually crashed and burned and deserved to be in fireplaces, because it turns out the investigators had unknowingly made critical methodological mistakes. And so that was a very powerful model for me of what not to do. Mm-hmm. That if you want the work to be right and you want the work to last, then be careful about methods. But secondly, what I learned from working with Howard Schuman was that the psychology of the communication process between an interviewer and a respondent is very subject to subtleties. And so Howard had been doing work. He just had published his important book with Stanley Presser on how the order of questions, how the order of answer choices, how the wordings of questions could often make significant differences. And for me, what was exciting is that really no psychologists had been working on that problem. I was coming into the field right at the moment when a group of psychologists, Roger Tarango, Norbert Schwartz, and others, were attracted because you could see these phenomena. It was easy to do the experiments and reproduce the results over and over again, but no one had worked on trying to explain it. And luckily for me, I stumbled into an explanation pretty quickly that seemed to work and explain a lot. And there's nothing more addicting in science than a little bit of success, so I stuck with it.
So tell us a little about the explanation.
Well, one of the way I got to work with Duane Allwyn was, how I had been told by Chick, work with this guy, and he was perfectly lovely when I went to be recruited, and he said, I hope we'll work together. So when I got there, I went down, knocked on his door, and said, Duane, I'm here. I'd like to work with you. And he said, well, I'm really busy. I don't have anything else that I can do with you. So going to come back in a month. We'll see. So come back in a month, knock, knock, knock. I'm busy. Come back in a month, knock, knock, knock. Eventually, he said, well, I do have these data that an experiment was run in the General Social Survey that varied the order of answer choices in a question measuring parental values. Maybe we could take a look at that. And so what it led to, really, not very slowly, was the development of the theory of survey satisficing. And it really just came from going in my office, closing the door, closing my eyes, and trying to think through psychologically, given all of the training that I'd had, what could explain why it was that people were inclined to choose the first options in a list or the last options in a list. And it just started in a small way, and so we worked together on that. And Duane said to me, you should develop this into a big theory. And so very generous of him to encourage me to do it. And I did it, and he stepped back and said, I don't need to take credit for this, just go ahead and push it. And really what that meant was like more closed door, closed eyes, imagining what could go on psychologically for people. I could never have imagined, I certainly wouldn't have bet any money, that most of those ideas would eventually turn out to be empirically supported. It was all just guessing stuff. But it turned out that a simple idea fleshed out explained a lot of data, and luckily led to practical implications about how to design questions, not just insights in how people think.
Yeah, the principle of satisficing now so firmly established as a principle, fundamental to what we do, and being able to recognize it and deal with it, anticipate it and avoid it is so critical. That's amazing.
There's a funny story in jazz that there are the stages of a jazz career. Stage one, people say, who's Steve Gadd? Stage two, people say, get me Steve Gadd. Stage three, get me somebody who sounds like Steve Gadd. Stage four, who's Steve Gadd? Now, it turns out that hasn't happened. Everybody knows who Steve Gadd is still. But in this, what I find humorous is that this idea has taken on so much of a life of its own that people start trying to explain it to me as if I never heard of it before.
Nice. What else was most appealing or interesting or resonant with you looking back from your from the graduate work?
Oh, Michigan was an incredible place to be. It was incredibly nurturing and supportive. The offices were configured in the Institute for Social Research in a way that was probably the antithesis of the way any scholar would want. They're all close to each other. The hallways are little. You can't be in your office without feeling the presence of everybody else. So it was really synergistic, and it was easy for me to go down one floor to the political scientists and another floor to the sociologists, and we all had the cafeteria that we ate in, and there were tons of talks, and you couldn't avoid becoming socialized as a professional, and to see what good work was and to see what important work was and to watch that success. And so the modeling and the inspiration and the social connections, there were lots of happy hours with faculty and time with other grad students. And so, you couldn't leave there without being excited about what you were doing. And for me, the most important features were Bob Zients, Hazel Marcus, James Jackson, Don Kinder, Howard Schuman, Duane Allwyn, and a variety of other faculty, where it wasn't hard to look at those people and say, I would like to grow up to be that. And it felt the same way for me at Harvard with Chick Judd. And I feel tremendous debt to all of those people for being great professionals, but for real. I mean, I had tons of lunches with Don Kinder. I spent time at his house and with his family. It really made a huge difference to feel like, as a person, you had a way to fit into the fabric of this social science that was really fun.
Amazing. So it was pretty well baked in then that you were going to go be a college professor, right? You're going to.
Oh no! I mean,
No?
I went to
No?
graduate school absolutely sure I was not going to be a college professor.
Were
That
you,
was the,
were you thinking applied research?
absolutely.
Oh,
I wanted to be
really?
you.
Interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And little did I know what life would be like for you. I'll tell you, when I went to graduate school, I said, number one, all the professors I know are off in academia writing papers for 50 of their friends. They were not connected to the real world in any way, and I wanted to make a difference. Now, where that came from, I don't know, but I will say that my father, in addition to helping a lot of people with diabetes in his office, was a journal editor and a college professor and an expert witness testifying in court. He did a lot of things. And so there was a model there of a happy man who was really appreciated professionally. And my professors were basically academic researchers. So I said, okay, I gotta do more than that. I gotta get out into the real world. And so that my third year of grad school, Christmas time, I wrote letters to 15 people like you at the time, including George Gallup himself. And I said, I'm interested. I'm not applying for a job. I'm not finishing graduate school, but I'm interested in whether you'd spend an hour with me when I'm on the East Coast over Christmas vacation, telling me about your work. And the first experience in response to those was, I don't know if you remember these, a little pink "while you were out" note. We had those little pads in those days. George Gallup called. Okay, so I call. So he meets with me, and so did everybody else. And these were mostly people who Howard Schuman had recommended, and so they were AAPOR people. And I took tremendous notes. I still have the notes on my laptop today, decades later, because I just learned so much. I knew I wasn't going to remember this. I had to write it down. And I became absolutely convinced at the end of it I wanted to be a college professor. And the reason was because at that time, not now, but at that time, I learned three things. Number one, none of those people decided what they did research on. Somebody else their clients were telling them what to do research on. Number two, speed was always more important than accuracy. That the timing was such that they felt frustrated that they couldn't have done more with the projects that they did. And three, for the most part, they said they couldn't actually identify any impact that their work had on anything. And so none of that sounded good for me. Furthermore, I will never forget this, people at the Roper organization said, and by the way, just to let you know, we probably wouldn't hire you because PhDs are overqualified for what we do, and we find they're too slow and too meticulous. Okay, so helpful experience, went on the academic job market, and I'm thrilled because what happened was the world transformed, and this is just my own theory, that the world transformed because back then the people who ran corporations, some of them graduated from college, not all of them graduated from college, but they definitely did not take an introductory psychology course where they learned about the science of social science. And so why do they need this stuff? But now, basically everybody who's running companies, I mean, the problem for those folks was social science wasn't even really invented till the 1950s or 60s, and they had gone to college before that. But now pretty much everybody has not only gone to college, but they've taken psychology courses. They understand it's a science. So the work we do is appreciated, and it has impact, and it is, for me personally, what I love about the academic setting is that I can do the work at whatever pace I want, on whatever topics I want, and I can publish them, and to my great relief and satisfaction, the world is interested in a fair amount of it, so that's cool too.
Fantastic. All right, so the search happens, and tell us about the decision, where you went.
So I applied for jobs, very confused about the job market. I applied in 4 disciplines, communication, psychology, political science, and sociology. I had interviews in all 4 fields. And by the end of the interviews, I realized I'm a psychologist. Ohio State offered me a position, and having been at Michigan with the rivalry with Ohio State, it was a little hard at first to consider that move, but it ended up that very shortly there was I took that job, and there was a lot of hiring that happened quickly, and we moved, I think, in the opinion of many people, into the first-ranked social psychology program in the world. I was so lucky that it was at the right time where the right hiring was done, and that the core faculty there were really spectacular people. And it was also a very intimate, socially linked, and energized and serious science program. And so, people had parties together, but they also had high standards for the science. And I had, I probably had 15 grad students working with me within a couple of years. And so it was an environment where I could be really very productive.
Interesting that of the four disciplines that you looked at, you, I think, currently hold appointments in all four of them, if I'm not
quite.
mistaken.
Sociology is allowing me a little respite,
Okay.
but I have published in all four of those fields, and I am on the faculty in communication and political science and
Amazing.
psychology.
All right. So the course of your research, then, going forward, did you wasn't all about satisficing. There were probably plenty of professors who would stake out a piece of turf that gorgeous and just spend the rest of your career defending it to the death. Instead, you continue to build out in your knowledge and in your the direction and range of your research. Where did you take it next, and how did you make these decisions going forward? Is it just, oh, that's interesting, oh, that's interesting? There's so many areas you've covered over the years.
Well, it's actually, I am both broad and really tradition bound. That almost everything I'm studying today is continuing work that I was doing 20 or 30 years ago. That once I get into a topic, I get addicted to it. So I've been studying the impact of candidate name order for decades. I've been studying questionnaire design for decades. I've been studying cigarette smoking attitudes and behavior for decades. So it's, and some of these topics like cigarette smoking, that I was hired to do that as an undergrad, and I thought maybe that would be the end of it, but I kept coming back to that topic again and again later. And so I do get interested in a question, and I keep wanting to work on that question. And but there definitely have been new topics introduced. The biggest one for me, in addition to studying voting and elections, which is my dissertation, that cigarette smoking and survey methods in terms of questionnaire design, the biggest innovation for me topic-wise has been moving into the study of sampling and mode in survey research.
This even preceded the increasing use of internet for data collection, did it? Or
it did, because I was on an advisory committee for the American National Election Studies that Michigan has run for decades, and they had been spending lots of money to do the highest quality data collections through face-to-face interviewing around the country since the 1940s. And there was increasing pressure in the 80s for Michigan to consider moving that study to the telephone. And that would have been a big cost saver. The advocates in the political science community said, oh man, for half the budget we could have 10 times the number of employees, 10 times the number of respondents.
Interviews.
Then yeah, we should really think about that. So I agreed to analyze data because it turns out a series of experiments had been done with the same questionnaire being administered side by side, face-to-face and by telephone. And what came out of that was clear evidence that the face-to-face interviewing was superior. And so we wrote that up, and that ended up helping NSF decide to stick with face-to-face interviewing, which they do still today. Then the internet comes online, and oh, we could save lots more money if we just move this over to the internet, so we started doing similar comparisons.
Interesting. Were the techniques you developed in the face-to-face versus telephone comparison similar to the ones you're employing now?
Absolutely, with one exception, that what we looked at in the early days were indicators of data quality. Were we accurately measuring what you think and what you have done? But we weren't comparing sample representativeness to the population. The introduction of internet surveys and the abandonment of random sampling has introduced this question of, can we actually measure the country accurately if we've got a bunch of people who have volunteered to do surveys for money where there's no random sampling involved? And the innovation there was to actually try to measure variables that are benchmarkable, where we know the truth of how many driver's licenses people have in America, how many passports they have, their answers to high-quality, face-to-face, high-response rate surveys about lots of topics, and we could assess the accuracy of the internet data.
And I would interject that your latest piece in this winter's POQ with Bo McGinnis in the lead is absolutely essential reading on the topic.
Glad you feel that way.
Yeah, really
She
good
did
stuff.
great work.
Okay, so what's your assessment then of where we've come after all these years of yours in the field? What's the state of the research enterprise? I don't like to use the word industry because we don't all do it as an industry, but it's an enterprise for academics, for government, for business, for associations, foundations, you name it. Where are we at with this effort to know and understand public attitudes?
Well, I think two answers to that question. Number one, we're in a great place. That for decades, scientific methods have worked beautifully. And I'll give you a sense of my experience in this regard. At one point a few years ago, I visited a friend of mine, Gary King, on the faculty at Harvard, and went into his office for our meeting. And his last guest was leaving, and he said, let me introduce you. This is John Krosnick. He's a professor at Stanford, and he's an expert in survey research. And this guest, who was actually on the Harvard faculty at the medical school, was an international medical researcher, said, "Oh, how sad for you." And I said, "Why do you say that?" And he said, "Well, we do a fair amount of surveys ourselves, and surveys are so inaccurate. How is it that you spend your life doing that?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean they're inaccurate?" So he said, "Well, you can ask people how tall they are and how much they weigh, and they don't even tell you the right answer. They overstate their height and they understate their weight." So I realized two important things. Number one, I didn't know there had been studies like that where we could tell whether people did that. And number two, I realized I did not have the comeback for him. I did not say, you need to read this book because this will show you how accurate surveys are. And I realized at that moment also, wait a minute, do I know that surveys are accurate? I mean, maybe they predict election outcomes sometimes, but when they're measuring how many bedrooms are in a person's house, or whether they've been diagnosed with emphysema, or whether they approve of the president or anything else, does random sampling and questioning actually work? And our field needs an answer to that question. How do we not have an answer to that question? And we didn't. So Lin Chia-Chang, who had gotten a PhD with me, decided to take on a project with me to address this. So we went out to gather every instance in which some kind of objective evaluation compared a survey measurement to the truth. And we wanted to assess how accurate those measurements are. And I'll tell you, I was really flabbergasted and delighted to find really, when scientific measurement was done, random sampling, believable benchmarks, that survey methods worked and produced results that were, in many cases, almost closer to the truth than our standard sampling error calculations would lead us to expect. Okay, so that's one answer. We're in great shape. We know how to do science. Even today, response rates have dropped. We know response rates are not an indicator of the quality of data, and what we do know is that scientific surveys done well continue to be remarkably accurate. On the other hand, the news is we're in a horrible place right now. And the reason we're in a horrible place right now is, I'm sorry to say, because of the internet. What the internet has done is to create a wonderful opportunity to collect data quickly and inexpensively. And when it is used with representative samples, truly random samples drawn from the population, it also works beautifully. But it has been almost too tempting to people to prevent them from creating opportunities to collect data in ways that are not with random samples and in other ways. And I'm perfectly open to the idea that that methodology might work, but we've now done evaluation after evaluation of it in comparison. And in contrast to claims that that method is superior to the traditional methods, which some claim have died, I see exactly the opposite in the data. Traditional methods continue to work beautifully, and the new methods are never more accurate, and they are often strikingly inaccurate by comparison. And so in 2016, we all went to bed the night before the presidential election thinking Hillary Clinton would be elected. And when we were surprised the next day to see the outcome of the election, I wasn't surprised, because the vast majority of the surveys that had been used by the aggregators to make the prediction didn't actually involve random samples. And in order to accurately predict who was going to become president, we didn't need any surveys in New York or California or other states that are predictable. We needed laser-sharp radar in the few states where the victory would be a small margin. And when we later gathered up the data and looked, there was literally one probability sample poll and many more, dozens of others, and even in the last week, that were misleading. So survey research now gets the reputation, not only in the US, but before Brexit and in Israel and other countries, as we've lost it. We can't measure anything accurately anymore. And the truth is, we can't measure anything accurately anymore if we constrain the budget to be near zero. But if we're still willing to pay for quality science, that method still does work nicely, and we see that over and over again. And let me be clear, I make no money from saying what I just said. I don't sell data, I buy data. For me to endorse the more expensive and scientific way of doing it, it accomplishes nothing for me except sharing what I believe to be the truth of the circumstances.
So there's some pushback. One is that response rates to probability-based surveys have gotten so low that they no longer truly classify or qualify as truly random sample probability-based surveys, and therefore we might as well find an alternative. What's the response to that?
Actually, my response is empirical. We now have, I completely endorse the idea that if we had a response rate of 100% for a randomly drawn sample, we would know there's no sampling error. And as the response rate drops, as the Office of Management and Budget and the White House now tells us in their documentation, the risk of non-response bias increases. Absolutely, that's indisputable. The real question, though, is, are the people who are responding when the survey response rate hits 40% or 30% or 20% or 5%, are they functionally a random sample or not? And to say, sorry, 5%, not. Okay, well, what number is? Is 30? Is 50? Is 70? The only way to know is to look at the data. And we now, as a field, have over and over again different investigators, different data, and what we learn is remarkably, if you draw a random sample, you work hard to get everybody to be interviewed as well as you can, best practices in every way of advanced contacts and refusal conversions and everything else, that the data are remarkably accurate. In fact, in 2016, in that election, the probability sample surveys done during the last week before the election with response rates less than 10% predicted the Trump and Clinton share of the vote with less than 1 percentage point of error. And the reason for this comes, I think, from a project that John Bullock and I did, John, professor in political science, where what we found is that the people who don't participate in surveys have a little bit less free time. They like to express their opinions a little bit less. They have fewer opinions, a little bit less, and so on. There are lots of characteristics of people who don't participate in surveys. But there are small differences, and they rarely distort the results that we care about.
Mm-hmm. So in your presentation at New York AAPOR last night, you included results of a survey you conducted using a non-probability panel. So is the answer that it's sometimes good enough? And is that an okay answer beyond your own research for industry and government and media and others?
So these days, I'm doing lots of studies with non-probability samples. And the reason is because I'm involved in a joint project with the University of California, Santa Barbara, University of California, Berkeley, and the University of Virginia, studying replication in social science. So each of the universities comes up with new experimental effects, and then the others try to replicate the effect to see what happens. Because, as many people know, we are experiencing what's called the replication crisis right now. We have discovered that lots of publications in scientific journals report results that can't be reproduced by other investigators, and that's horrifying, especially if you assumed everything was for real in those journals. And so what we're finding is that when you don't cheat, when you're transparent with your methods, we're not having any trouble reproducing each other's findings. And these tests are done independently in a way that I find very convincing. And so what that suggests, and those are all, by the way, based upon non-probability samples, but all essentially recruited the same way. So ads on websites, invitations to members of frequent flyer clubs, and so on, assembled with quotas and differential sampling rates for different demographic groups. What we're finding is that those data are suitable for experimental studies. In other words, randomly assigning some respondents to this experience, other respondents to that experience, looking for a difference between the two. And in general, what we're finding is that those results seem to replicate quite nicely even when these other schools are using different sources of those data. However, we also have our own experimental data where the same experiment has been administered by 9 or 10 companies by us, and we see remarkable differences in the results that have to be due to sampling problems. So I would say that problem is as yet unresolved, and yet I'm happy to do experiments in that arena to learn how they work and to learn whether they can be informative in understanding the effects of manipulations. Mm-hmm. But I would never take those studies and say, well, we got 82% of these people saying X, so 82% of the country believe that.
Interesting. Beautiful. So, looking now ahead into the future of the industry, or the enterprise, I should say, there are new technologies coming aboard. There's new experimentation in different data collection methods. Um, are there any that you're most hopeful about, any that you're most skeptical of, and what do you see down the road for the future?
Well, I am, as like you, I'm looking at a world in which big data are crashing in our faces, and I think it's very exciting to imagine the potential uses of big data. But my personal experiences with big data have now been going on for a while, looking at what are often called voter files. So each state creates a record of all the individuals who are registered to vote. They vary a little bit from state to state. Some provide sex, others don't. But when we're looking at those data files, we're using them to compare to survey responses and to assess whether we could use the records to gauge accuracy of survey responses. And in order to do that, two things have to be true. Number one, the records have to be accurate. And number two, the process of figuring out, are you this Gary Langer, or are you some other Gary Langer, or are you not in the file at all because you're not registered? All of that becomes a challenge. And what we've discovered through that work is, unfortunately, voter registration records and voter turnout records are such that I'm convinced that survey responses are more accurate than they are, because of all the problems in matching and in the accuracy of those records. So all you got to do is look at the records. You can see that what the files that the government agencies create are not error-free. You got every voter, but they're not error-free. And so from that experience, my feeling is, let's not let survey research die, please, because it's important and valuable, and in many cases quicker and richer than you can get from records. And I think that's probably true in lots of cases. You know, you can be Chase Bank and you can have huge amounts of data on all your customers, but you're not going to tell from those electronic records whether Gary Langer is happy or unhappy with his last visit to the bank. We have to ask him to find out, and that's going to be consequential. People who tell, I don't need to talk to Gary Langer. I can just look at when he last used the ATM and how much money he took out, and if he has a savings account with us, and I can predict whether he's going to leave the bank or not. I say, great, you show me, because in social science what we know is it's hard to predict, maybe you can get 5, 10, 15, 20% of the variance, but I'll bet you I can add something by a survey. And so I feel like I hope that the infrastructure doesn't go away. And I'll tell you this story in the jazz world, when September 11th hit and many Americans cocooned and decided, I think better not to leave the house. The first thing to go, as you might remember here in New York, like Broadway and artistic performances, audiences plummeted, and Broadway actors were desperately encouraging, it's safe, come to the theater, it'll be great. People stopped going to jazz clubs, and not only did jazz clubs close, jazz magazines closed, jazz radio stations turned into country and western stations. The infrastructure of jazz shrank. But the economy recovered pretty quickly. But once the radio station's country and western, it's not going to, oh great, now we can go back to being jazz. Doesn't happen that way. Once the jazz magazine employees got jobs working elsewhere, they don't say, oh great, let's quit Newsweek and we'll go back to the jazz magazine and create that. So the infrastructure doesn't come back. And if we lose the infrastructure to do super high quality face-to-face surveys and telephone surveys, and for that matter, internet surveys, I'll be very sad. So I hope that we as a society don't get so enamored with what makes money that we lose track of what's accurate, and that there's still a place for high quality science.
Beautiful. Okay, so we've got to talk a little about the jazz, right? Because you've been accused of being a professor and distinguished researcher solely to support your jazz habit. 150 gigs a year. First of all, how do you do it? And second of all, why do you do it?
Well, it's my mother's fault. My mother was an opera singer, and she felt strongly that her kids were going to become musicians. And so I spent 10 summers in northern Michigan when I was from 9 to 18 years old at the National Music Camp, where I learned to be a classical percussionist and a jazz drummer. And I loved it. I studied with Danny Hinger, who was the timpanist in the Metropolitan Opera Orchestra here in New York. And I won the concerto competition with the Philadelphia Orchestra and performed with them. And music was just in me. There was no way that I was going to live the rest of my life not playing. But I couldn't do classical music and jazz, so at college I decided to let classical music go behind, and I have been playing jazz since then. The band that I co-created in Michigan in grad school is still together. We're 37 years later playing, about to release a new record. 28 years ago, I created a band when I was at Ohio State that continues today called Charged Particles. I was very, very lucky to have two spectacular companions in that band to start with, Caleb Hutzler and Mike Rack, piano and bass. Great composers, great players. We had amazing opportunities to put that music out, and we were blessed with much better reviews, I thought, than we deserved. And luckily, they opened doors, and we were on the radio, and I was able to move the band out to California, and very, very lucky to be working with two wonderfully talented keyboardists, Murray Lowe and Greg Sankovich, two great bass players, Aaron Germain and Fred Randolph, and guests. Most importantly, we've gotten hooked up with Paul McCandless, a Grammy-winning superstar of jazz saxophone and reeds, who lives near us, and we tour the world with him. He's opened up a lot of doors for us, and so the gigs are a great release for me. Many of them are close to home, so I can be at Stanford during the day and then go off and play at night. But we're going on Sunday for an 8-day tour of Southern California. We're going to make our debut at the famed Baked Potato down there, which is a big-name jazz club, and do a whole series of other performances. And we did 10 days in England twice last year. We did 5 days in Canada twice last year, Indonesia for 15 days the year before that. And so it's just such a thrill for me. And I just figure, all right, as long as this lasts, I'll keep doing it, because at some point it's going to stop.
And a little research in your spare time.
I'm in the van typing the whole time.
Fantastic. All right, so we didn't touch on AAPOR. Let's do that a little bit. You are, what got you into AAPOR in the first place? A recommendation at school? You were a student paper award winner 30-odd years ago. How'd you get into the association, and what sort of a home have you found there?
Well, when I was working with Howard Schuman in graduate school, Howard was very connected to AAPOR and was eventually AAPOR president, of course. And he said, this is a good paper. You should submit it to the student paper competition. And so I won it. I won it in a year when Bob Cubey also won it. Bob, amazingly, became a professor of communication at Rutgers, passed away sadly recently, but amazingly, he was a drummer also during his life. And so there were various connections for us from that early day. But I went to the first meeting of AAPOR, and it was a really moving experience, because, as you know, we have a name tag that where when you are the student paper award winner, there's like a flag on there saying student paper award winner. And at any normal academic conference, that would accomplish absolutely nothing. But at AAPOR, people spotted this, and they said, "Oh, congratulations! Who are you? Way to go! Let's talk." So you were never like feeling alone. You were never feeling like, "Who am I going to have lunch with?" That there was this really warm, welcoming experience. And back in those days, in the '80s, AAPOR wasn't that big, and everybody was interesting. And so it was really nice to feel welcomed into a professional community outside of graduate school, of people internationally. And so I gave a talk, my award, got my award at the banquet, and I thought, okay, I am bonded. I am like Konrad Lorenz's little ducks. This is my organization. And so I have been connected ever since. And truthfully, I am in professions that would take me to conferences in psychology and political science and in political psychology, which is its own field. But the meeting I go to every year is AAPOR, and the organization that I feel the most connected to is AAPOR, because it's my field.
And 30 years later, winner of the AAPOR Award for Lifetime Achievement. It's quite a run of 30 years at AAPOR and in your career more generally.
Incredibly humbling.
Yeah, just fantastic. Okay, so just thinking across your career and thinking through it, thinking ahead, what else haven't we talked about? What other thoughts or comments do you want to share?
I will take this opportunity to make one last comment about you. That I'm so delighted that you agreed to do this interview, and I'm so grateful for our friendship and colleagueship over the years. I think of you as one of the leading lights of this field, and a guy who came from journalism into a scientific field and became a leader in the science of it all. And I am so glad that you do what you do for survey research. I'm so glad that you have had this platform at ABC, and that your polls are so importantly playing leadership roles. They get visibility. Some people would say they've influenced the White House recently, in fact. And the fact that you're such a charming and warm friend, and that we have had the opportunity to reinforce each other because we think alike so much, and to collaborate has been a privilege for me. So thank you for doing this.
We'll cut that part out. Thanks, John, and congratulations.
Thank you, Gary.